Polish peasants turned frozen Mongol corpses into market decorations, selling soup while children threw snowballs at their former terrorizers. This is the story of how Europe's greatest nightmare became a laughingstock, and how teaching sheep to be wolves created their own executioners. For 20 years, Europe had nightmares about the Mongols. They remembered Legnica, where warriors filled 9 sacks with European ears. They remembered drinking cups made from children's skulls, 100,000 knights slaughtered in 3 days, cities where only cats survived because even rats had been eaten. But in 1259, when the Golden Horde returned expecting another feast of conquest, they would find something they'd never encountered before, an enemy that had learned from its nightmares. The Mongol war machine moved like a force of nature, consuming civilizations with methodical precision. Each warrior traveled with 5 to 10 mounts, rotating them for speed, drinking their blood, using their hides for armor. While European knights clattered across battlefields in heavy armor on single destriers, Mongol cavalry flowed like water, striking where enemies were weakest, vanishing before counterattacks could form. Here's the twisted part. This greatest strength would become their doom. Their psychological warfare was devastating. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they erased them. At Ryazan, they built pyramids from skulls. At Kiev, travelers reported hearing bones grinding under wagon wheels 6 years after the fall. The mere approach of Mongol tumans sent populations fleeing, abandoning fortresses that had stood for centuries. But the foundation of all Mongol power rested on one critical element: horses. A Mongol without horses wasn't a warrior. He was just a man in fur clothing very far from home. And one man had been watching, learning, waiting 20 years for revenge. Little did the Mongols know, they were riding into the most elaborate death trap in medieval history. Duke Bolesław, the chaste of Poland, was transformed by defeat. His family butchered in earlier raids, his lands ravaged, his people enslaved. While other nobles dreamed of glorious cavalry charges, Bolesław had spent 2 decades studying Mongol tactics with the cold eye of a scholar dissecting a predator. He understood what others refused to accept: the old ways were extinct. To defeat monsters, you had to become something worse. 3 months before the invasion, Polish forces began the most extensive scorched earth campaign in medieval history. Every village within 50 miles was evacuated. Every field burned to ash. Every well poisoned with rotting corpses, lime and arsenic. They salted grazing lands with substances that would kill any animal attempting to feed. But the real genius was diabolical. They left behind gift horses. Beautiful Polish mares, the finest breeding stock, left grazing in abandoned pastures. But these animals carried glanders, a highly contagious disease that spreads through horse populations like wildfire. The infected animals showed no symptoms, making them perfect Trojan horses. Meanwhile, Duke Bolesław recruited not knights but peasants, men who knew the forests, who could move silently in winter, who had spent 20 years dreaming of revenge for murdered families. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were hunters, and they had been given simple instructions: kill Mongols like you would kill wolves. No honor, no mercy, just death. When Mongol general Nogai Khan crossed the Vistula with 30,000 riders in December 1259, his scouts reported something disturbing. The land ahead was dead. Every village empty, every field black ash, every well filled with bloated corpses. The Polish population had vanished like smoke, taking every grain of wheat. They had even dug up graveyards and taken the bones, denying Mongols the possibility of grinding skeletal remains for calcium. The earth itself had declared war. The Mongols had no idea they were marching into their own graveyard. By the second week, the gift horses began showing symptoms. Mongol mounts started coughing blood, their necks swelling with abscesses that burst and spread infection. The Mongols, not understanding disease transmission, moved sick horses with healthy reserves, spreading glanders throughout their herd. Within 3 weeks, horses were dying by hundreds daily, their bodies left in a trail of death that wolves followed. The psychological impact was devastating. Mongol warriors who had conquered from China to Hungary found themselves marching through a landscape that seemed cursed by dark magic. Their most experienced veterans began to mutter about evil spirits and poisoned earth. Morale, the invisible foundation of every army, began to crack like ice in spring thaw. But the psychological torture was just beginning. Polish raiders began their ghost war. They waited for Mongol scouting parties to make camp, then attacked during the deepest sleep hours. But they didn't fight, they simply cut horse throats and vanished. A Mongol warrior might wake to find his mounts dead, their blood turning snow to red slush, with no enemy in sight. Without horses in enemy territory in winter, he was already dead. One unit of 500 men woke to find every horse's throat cut, arranged in a perfect circle around their camp. The Poles had done it silently, even sentries hadn't noticed. The message was clear: we can kill you whenever we want. Here's where it gets worse. The Poles began leaving abandoned supply caches, barrels of mead, sacks of grain, preserved meats all poisoned with hemlock, but not enough to kill immediately, just enough to cause agonizing cramps and bloody diarrhea. One desperate captain, Badar, wrote to Nogai Khan, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We conquer empty villages and rule over ghosts. My men soil themselves with blood and see demons. The horses eat bark, their own dung, and eventually each other. This land is cursed." If you're fascinated by these incredible reversals of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories about the battles that changed the world. By January 1260, the situation was desperate. Mongol horses were eating bark, dung, leather equipment, and eventually each other. Warriors who had once drunk mare's milk now watched their mounts collapse from starvation. The Polish strategy was working perfectly. They had turned Poland into a desert that consumed armies. And then Duke Bolesław was ready to spring his final trap. The Duke had been retreating for weeks, always just out of reach, leaving poisoned supplies and dead land behind. The Mongols, down to 15,000 effective warriors from their original 30,000, pursued him towards Sandomierz on the Vistula River. They thought they had him cornered. They had never been more wrong. Duke Bolesław had spent 2 months preparing a killing field designed specifically for Mongols. What happened next wasn't just a victory, it was the most brutal reversal in military history. The Mongols approached to find Polish forces in traditional formation, knights in front, infantry behind, banners flying. It looked like every formal European battle they had crushed before. Nogai Khan ordered his standard tactic: feigned retreat to draw out knights, then shower them with arrows. But when Mongol cavalry began their retreat, something unprecedented happened. The Polish knights didn't follow. They stood there, waiting with the patience of farmers watching crops grow. Wait, it gets worse. The Mongols wheeled around for their arrow assault and discovered the trap. Their weakened horses couldn't gallop in deep trenches hidden under snow and branches. Horses broke legs by dozens, throwing riders into concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes smeared with human feces. The trap had been perfectly designed to counter every Mongol advantage. Their mobility was neutralized. Their archery was useless at close range. Their psychological dominance evaporated as they found themselves floundering helplessly in a maze of their enemy's design, like wolves caught in a hunter's snare. Polish crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions. But they weren't aiming at warriors, they shot the horses, every single mount, methodically, efficiently. Each bolt represented 20 years of accumulated rage, 20 years of nightmares about Mongol hoofbeats. The Mongols, watching their mounts die, realized they were now infantry in enemy territory in winter, hundreds of miles from support. Their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness, expert horsemen reduced to stumbling foot soldiers. But the real slaughter hadn't even begun. Thousands of peasants poured from the forest like a human avalanche, armed with farming implements, flails for grain, hooks for hay, hammers for horseshoes, scythes for wheat. Bolesław had promised them bounties: 1 silver penny for every Mongol ear, 2 for a thumb, and a gold ducat for a commander's head. What followed was less combat than harvesting. The Mongol warriors, trained from childhood for mounted warfare, tried to form defensive circles on foot. But they were exhausted from weeks of poisoning and starvation, many still suffering from the effects of contaminated supplies, wearing armor designed for horseback, not ground combat. The peasants swarmed them like ants on dying beetles, like farmers descending on ripened fields. They used harvest scythes to cut tendons, grain flails to crush skulls, and pruning hooks to drag warriors down into the mud where they could be dealt with using hammers and stones. One Polish chronicler described it with chilling matter-of-factness. The Tatars died not like warriors, but like sheep in slaughter season. Our peasants worked in teams, turning killing into a craft like threshing wheat, each man knowing his role in the deadly harvest. Think this story deserves to be shared. Pass it along to someone who loves military history. They'll thank you for it. The ear harvest, as it became known among the peasants, lasted 3 hours of methodical butchery. Some peasants, being practical-minded, cut off both ears despite the single payment rule, figuring they could sell the extra ones to less successful hunters at market prices. Others collected Mongol fingers to make necklaces that they would sell to merchants as protection charms against evil spirits. The Mongol commanders, identified by their silk undershirts and gold ornaments, were kept alive briefly, just long enough for peasants to negotiate among themselves who got to claim the head bounty. Then they were beheaded with the same axes used to slaughter pigs, their screams mixing with peasant work songs that had been sung during grain harvests for generations. It was the harvest they had waited 20 years for, and they sang while they reaped their terrible crop. Here's the most twisted part. Nogai Khan himself survived the slaughter, but only because Duke Boleswar wanted him to. The Duke had something special planned for the great general who had terrorized Europe for decades, something that would send a message that would echo across the steppes for generations. The Mongol commander was stripped naked, painted with pig blood, the ultimate humiliation for a warrior of the steppes, and forced to ride a donkey backward through 20 Polish villages while peasants threw dung and rotten vegetables. In each village, the locals were allowed to cut off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a piece of ear, a toe, but not enough to kill him. The goal was maximum humiliation, not quick death. By the time he reached the final village, Nogai Khan was missing numerous small parts and begging for death in broken Polish words he had learned from his tormentors. Instead, they castrated him with sheep shears and sent him back to the Golden Horde as a living message written in flesh and blood. This is what Europe does to invaders now. The transformation was complete. In 1241, Europe had trembled before Mongol horsemen, like sheep before wolves. By 1263, European peasants wore necklaces of Mongol finger bones, while their children played games called Hunt the Tartar, with captured helmets of dead warriors, turning terror into entertainment. But Europe wasn't finished teaching lessons to the world. News of the Polish victory spread across Europe like wildfire in drought season, igniting what historians call the Mongol Hunt of 1261 to 1263. Suddenly, every minor lord wanted Mongol heads for their castle walls. Bounty hunters specialized in tracking down Mongol stragglers hiding in forests and mountain caves. The Teutonic Knights sent cleansing parties deep into Eastern Europe to find and exterminate any remaining Mongol camps. At Kressenbrunn in Austria, King Ottokar II of Bohemia conducted his own extermination campaign. The battle was different from Sandomierz. This was heavily armored knights against Mongol cavalry in open field combat. But the Bohemians had learned from 20 years of defeat, studying every Mongol victory to understand how to counter their advantages. Instead of charging recklessly, they formed hollow squares bristling with pikes like mobile fortresses. Swiss mercenaries with crossbows stood inside, creating kill zones that horses couldn't enter. When Mongol arrows bounced harmlessly off improved plate armor, when their cavalry charges impaled themselves on pike walls like fish on fishing spears, the Mongols realized their traditional tactics were obsolete. The Bohemian heavy cavalry, held in reserve like a trump card, waited until the Mongol horses were exhausted from futile charges against the pike squares. Then they attacked with devastating effect. These weren't the old-style knights who had been slaughtered at Legnica. These wore full plate armor that Mongol arrows couldn't penetrate, rode massive destriers that trampled Mongol ponies, and wielded warhammers designed specifically to crush through Mongol lamellar armor. The killing at Kressenbrunn was so thorough that Ottokar ordered his men to stop taking ears because there were too many to count. Instead, they piled Mongol heads into pyramids along the main trade route from Vienna to Prague. Over 50 pyramid markers, each containing between 100 and 300 heads, served as grim warnings to any future invaders who might consider following the Mongol example. Meanwhile, the most horrifying fate awaited Mongol stragglers who fled into the Carpathian Mountains, seeking refuge in terrain they thought would protect them from European pursuit. Winter in the Carpathians is brutal, even with supplies and preparation. The Mongol survivors, perhaps 3,000 men who had escaped the various slaughters, found themselves trapped in mountain passes with no food, no horses, and temperatures dropping to -30 degrees Celsius. Polish and Hungarian mountain villages had been warned they were coming through networks of church bells and signal fires. The villagers blocked passes with fallen trees, destroyed bridges over mountain streams, and then waited for winter to do their work with the patience of professional executioners. Starvation in mountains follows a predictable pattern that the villagers knew well from harsh winters. First the leather, belts, boots, saddles, anything made from animal hide. Then the frozen horse carcasses, if any remained. Then bark from trees and pine needles, anything with minimal nutritional value. And finally, by week 4 of starvation, each other. A Hungarian patrol found a Mongol camp where the occupants had clearly turned cannibal out of desperate hunger. Bodies were butchered with the same precision Mongols used on sheep, showing their expertise extended beyond warfare. Major muscle groups removed systematically, bones cracked for marrow, even the skin cooked into a sort of crackling. The survivors had established rules for their cannibalism. The sick were eaten first, then the wounded, then lots were drawn among the healthy. One Mongol warrior's journal, recovered from his frozen corpse clutched in his dead fingers, contained a final confession that revealed the complete psychological breakdown. "We ate Timur yesterday. He was my brother in arms for 6 years, fought beside me from China to Hungary. His liver was diseased, black with spots like a plague victim, but we ate it anyway because we had no choice. Tomorrow they will share me among themselves. The mountains are full of demons that look like peasants, watching us die slowly." The mountain villages indeed watched and waited with the patience of hunters observing trapped prey. When Mongol groups became weak enough from starvation, peasants would attack with hunting bows and boar spears, but mostly they just waited for winter to complete their revenge. They would find frozen Mongols in spring, perfectly preserved by the cold, their faces twisted in expressions of final agony. The bodies were stripped of anything valuable: weapons, armor, gold ornaments, even dental work, and left for wolves and ravens. Some villages developed a gruesome economy around Mongol corpses, treating them like any other natural resource. They harvested tendons for bowstrings, hair for brushes, and skulls for drinking cups. A bitter reversal of what Mongols had done to Europeans at Legnica and other battlefields. Every household in the region had Mongol skull bowls used specifically for feast days and religious celebrations, a way of literally consuming their former oppressors. Let us know in the comments what other incredible military reversals you'd like to see covered next. The few hundred Mongol survivors who made it through the mountains faced a final horror that perhaps exceeded even the cannibalism: the slave markets. The Venetians, always pragmatic about profit and opportunity, had established a robust trade in Mongol prisoners, but these weren't warriors anymore. They were broken, starving, often mutilated survivors who had eaten human flesh to survive and bore the psychological scars of their complete defeat. The Venetians bought them for almost nothing from Hungarian peasants who treated them like livestock, then sold them to Egyptian Mamluks who found ironic satisfaction in enslaving the sons of men who had enslaved half the known world. The slave ships were floating hells, prisoners packed into holds designed for cargo, chained to prevent suicide, fed just enough slop to keep them alive until sale. Many went completely mad from the reversal of fortune, unable to process the transformation from world conquerors to human merchandise. Mongol children received different treatment based on age and gender. Boys under 10 were castrated and sold as eunuchs to guard harems. The survival rate from the crude castration performed by ship surgeons was perhaps 1 in 3. Those who survived were trained to forget they were ever Mongol, raised to serve in the palaces of the very civilizations their fathers had tried to destroy. Mongol girls were sold to brothels across the Mediterranean, marketed specifically as daughters of the conquerors for clients who took sadistic pleasure in dominating the offspring of feared warriors. The advertisements played up their exotic heritage while emphasizing their complete subjugation. Back in Poland, Duke Bolesław ordered a special monument built from Mongol bones to commemorate the victory and serve as a permanent reminder. At the site of Sandomierz, Polish peasants constructed a church whose foundation mortar was mixed with ground Mongol bones. Its walls were decorated with Mongol skulls arranged in the pattern of crosses. Its altar was made from a single block of stone, where Nogai Khan had been castrated. They called it the Church of Divine Vengeance, and it became a pilgrimage site for those seeking protection from future invasions. The immediate military impact was decisive and permanent. The Mongol invasion force of 30,000 had been essentially exterminated through systematic planning and execution. Perhaps 500 made it back to the Golden Horde, many missing ears, fingers, or other parts, telling tales of poisoned earth and enemies who fought without honor or mercy. But Europe wasn't finished teaching lessons to would-be conquerors. The Golden Horde made one desperate final attempt at retaliation in 1262, hoping to salvage something from the disaster. A force of 10,000 riders was sent to raid Poland as punishment for the humiliation. They made it exactly 30 miles past the border before discovering that Polish peasants had developed an early warning system using church bells that could relay messages across vast distances. Within hours, every village for 50 miles knew Mongols were coming. The earth was scorched ahead of them with the same methodical efficiency as before. Wells were poisoned with rotting corpses, and Polish wolf packs of mounted peasants shadowed them constantly like hunting dogs tracking wounded prey. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were farmers who had learned to fight like Mongols, adopting their hit-and-run tactics but with crucial knowledge of the terrain that gave them every advantage. They would strike at night, kill sentries, steal horses, poison supplies, then vanish into forests the Mongols didn't know, like ghosts seeking revenge. The Mongol commander, Burundai, reported in growing desperation to his superiors, "We are not fighting an army, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer, every stream is poisoned, every village is empty but watching. My men are afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to drink water. This is not war, it is being slowly digested by a hostile country that has learned to consume invaders." After 2 weeks of this psychological torture that drove several warriors to madness, the Mongols retreated in complete disorder. As they withdrew in humiliation, Polish peasants followed like wolves trailing a wounded herd, picking off stragglers and wounded. The final insult came at the border, where Polish children, some as young as 7, stood on hills throwing rocks at the retreating Mongol army while singing mocking songs about the brave horsemen who ran from farmers. The Mongols, who had conquered the greatest empires on earth from China to Hungary, were being laughed at by children who had learned nursery rhymes about their defeat. The Golden Horde never again attempted another serious invasion of Central Europe. The psychological impact of complete defeat had broken something fundamental in their confidence and military culture. Within a generation, the Mongol Empire began its long fragmentation that would see it disappear as a unified force. The Yuan dynasty in China would fall to native rebellion, the Ilkhanate in Persia would collapse into warring factions, the Golden Horde would shrink and divide into smaller khanates that squabbled among themselves. The spell of Mongol invincibility was broken forever when Polish peasants proved that the world's greatest warriors were just men who could be killed with farming tools and systematic planning. Stories filtered back along the Silk Road like poison in the bloodstream of the empire. The great Mongol warriors defeated by European farmers, their generals castrated like sheep, their children sold in slave markets, their bones ground into mortar for churches. Other peoples who had submitted to Mongol rule for decades began to wonder if Polish peasants could destroy the invincible Mongol army with poisoned wells and farming tools. What exactly were they so afraid of? Rebellions began breaking out across the empire as the myth of Mongol invincibility died in Polish snow. Today, archaeologists still find mass graves along the Carpathian mountain passes Mongol warriors who died from starvation and cold, their bones bearing teeth marks indicating cannibalism in their final desperate weeks. In Polish museums, You can see the preserved harvest tools, the modified scythes and flails specifically designed for killing dismounted Mongols, passed down through families as heirlooms of victory. Some rural Polish churches still have foundation stones that, when tested by modern scientists, contain unusual amounts of human calcium, the ground bones of Mongol warriors mixed into mortar over 7 centuries ago, still binding the stones together. The Mongols called their empire the Eternal Blue Sky, believing it would last forever under heaven's protection. But they discovered that even eternity ends at the edge of a Polish peasant's scythe wielded by farmers who had learned the art of systematic slaughter. The last Mongol to leave Poland alive in 1263 was a young scout named Kutuz, who had lost his ears, nose, and fingers to Polish peasants but somehow survived the mountain crossing. He made it back to the Golden Horde and lived another 40 years, warning every young warrior about the land of death where the earth itself was poisoned and farmers wore necklaces of Mongol bones. He ended every warning the same way, his mutilated face serving as living proof of his words. They say we were invincible, that the blue sky protected us. We were not invincible. We were just men far from home who learned that teaching sheep to be wolves means one day the sheep will eat you. The Mongols had created their own executioners through 20 years of brutality and terror. They really should have stayed in the steppes where they belonged, instead of teaching peaceful farmers the art of systematic slaughter that would ultimately be turned against them. Want to see more incredible stories of how the underdog triumphed against impossible odds? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. History is full of these amazing reversals, and we're just getting started uncovering them.